Oh, yes. Okay. So for the recording, thank you for coming to the Advanced CSS workshop. Let's get a few logistics out of the way first. If you want to follow along with this slide yourself, you can click the top tiny URL link. Also, I wrote a README to supplement this workshop, so that'll be the bottom tiny URL link. Some of the mentors can directly put those links in the chat, so it's easy to access those. That'll be great. Cool. I'll just leave it on this slide for a little bit. Okay, let's get going. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, the membership portal is down right now, but if it were up, the attendance code would have been flexible boxable. You can keep trying throughout the workshop. But yeah, if you don't know what the reference is about, you will in about 2 hours. And on the bottom, we have a link to the feedback form, which you can use to write about how you thought about this workshop, what went well, what didn't go well. And it does really help us to make other future workshops a little bit better. And you get a chance to win an Amazon gift card, so who doesn't like that? Great. One final thing. After the core curriculum is done for Hackschool, we're going to be teaching a couple of advanced workshops for you guys. These workshop topics have not been solidified yet, but a couple of ideas that we've been bouncing around behind the scenes are like React, Node.js and Express, and databases. But you guys get the final say in what we will be teaching. So be sure to fill that form out on the link right there. And it's kind of ironic to say, but yeah, your vote counts. All right, so let's go into the meat of this workshop. I want to preface it really quick with, if you are confused at any point, please do not be afraid to ask questions. This workshop is pretty loaded with advanced CSS topics, so we do not expect you to pick up all of it immediately. These slides, my README, will all be there for reference in the future, and a lot of stuff is also one Google or one Stack Overflow post away. So yeah, feel free to ask questions. The mentors will be active answering those, and I'll also stop at different points of this workshop to answer them directly. So the goal of this workshop is to teach you guys advanced CSS techniques that will further style your websites, both making them a little more pretty as well as making them easier to work with. So previously in Hackschool, what exactly did we learn about CSS? We had an entire workshop in our session 1 that taught us about basic CSS fundamentals. It's okay if you weren't able to attend that one. I'm going to be doing a quick CSS recap for you guys here, or if you just needed a quick refresher. So CSS, as we learned, stands for cascading style sheets, and it defines the style of the HTML elements on the web page. This definition is a little bit misleading because it doesn't only cover the style, but also covers the layout. So how the different items of your web page are laid out in the web page, as well as variations. So that's how your website looks in different screen sizes. And for variation, we're going to be actually doing a completely separate workshop on this later on in Hackschool on responsive design. So be on the lookout for that. So to use CSS, what you have to do is first create a file that is named anything you want, but it does have to end in .css to mark it as a CSS file. And to use it in your HTML file, what you do is add the link HTML tag under the title HTML tag within the head HTML tag. There's a lot of tags, but here's a visual reference for you guys here. With every link tag that you're linking a CSS file in, you do always have to put the rel equals style sheet. This is marking that this file is related to this HTML file as a style sheet because it's CSS. And the href is just a link to the file. So in our case, it's just style.css. Okay, so this is the syntax for any rule that you add into CSS. You have a selector, so that's what you want to apply the style on. You have a property, which is the specific style property that you want to set, as well as value. So that's the value the property takes on. And just as an example, this is the h1 tag that we have chosen as our selector. So we're saying that on our web page, for every h1 tag, we want to set the text color which is our property, to red. So that's our value. So this is that rule in action. In our style.css file, let's say we've added this h1 rule. And in our index.html file, let's say we've added this CSS file in using the link tag, and we have set this h1 tag that just says heading. So if we open this web page, we'll see in the browser that heading now in fact is red, which is cool because that's what it's supposed to do. So here is an entire table of basic properties and values. I won't be going too much into detail about each one of these, but this will always be here for reference. And again, it's one Google search away. Just going down the list, color is what we just saw, which sets the color of the text. Font size sets the size of the text, so how big it is. Font family is a type of the text font, so like Arial or Comic Sans. Border is the style of the border, so what is wrapping around the HTML element. Padding is the space the element itself takes. And finally, margin is the space that the element has between other elements on the web page. So let's dive deeper into the selector first. First up, selectors can be any HTML element. So we've already seen h1, but it can also be anything else that is the base element. So that's div, that's body, span, paragraph, all that sort of stuff. But on top of this, selectors can also be a custom class or ID that we ourselves define. And the way we apply styles onto these is by using a special kind of notation. So for classes, you add a period to the front to mark it as a class. So in this case, we have a .myClass, and we've set the text color to black. And on the right side, we set a special ID. So the way we mark that is using a hashtag. So hashtag myID, that color will be pink. So in order to use classes and IDs, we not only have to put that in our style.css file, but we also have to create a class in our HTML file. So in this first h1, you can see that we've set class equal to myClass so that the styles of that specific class selector can be applied to there. And on the bottom, the ID equals myID has been set to the second h1 element. So if you take a look on the right, the top line is black because we set that h1 to be black. And the bottom one is pink because we set that h1 to be pink. And just a quick note, classes can be reused on multiple HTML elements. I think this was a question that was raised in session 1, whereas ID has to uniquely identify one single element on the page. So if there are multiple IDs, I think there will be an error. And for why I chose black and pink, I don't know, there were just two random colors I chose. You really could choose anything when you're doing CSS. Those were the two that just came in my mind. But yeah, you can just do anything you want. All right, so that was a quick recap. I will pause here for any questions. Okay, I think, unless I'm mistaken, they were all answered by mentors. All right, looks good. Let us now make CSS advanced. So before I do that, let's just all enjoy this meme on the right for a while. How fast you guys are going to be at doing this. So, all right, now let's make it advanced. First, let's take a look into how we can make style advanced. So here are the topics we're going to be talking about to make style a little bit more advanced. First, we'll be taking a look at the specific quirks of CSS that make it behave the way it does. So that's three things: cascading, specificity, and inheritance. Oh, Rohan, nice. Yeah, we'll be going over inheritance. So pseudo-classes are next. And then we'll be talking about how to make your websites move. So that's transitions and animations. And yeah, so later on, we'll be also advancifying layout. But first, let's take a look at these specific subcategories of style. Okay, cool. So let's dive into cascading first. So as we've learned, CSS stands for cascading style sheets, but why exactly is it cascading? So to take a look at why this is the case, let's look at this example of a hypothetical style.css file we specified. So we set the div to have a width and height of 350 pixels. We've also set it to have a background color of blue and then green. And as a quick note, please do not make your CSS look like this. Your future coworkers will not, they'll be annoyed at you straight up. But we do need to make it like this in order to portray what cascading does. So now let's say we have this style.css. We've successfully added it to this index.html using the link tag, and we have set a div. So with all of this information, can you guys guess what background color the div will have? And this is me opening up to the chat. I want to see this light up like Twitch chat. Someone put orange? Okay. All right, yeah, for the most part, you guys are right on the dot. It is green. Thank you for the PogChamps. So it is green because in CSS, rules are applied in the order that they are written, so from top to bottom. So what exactly happens is it scans through this file. It first marks the width and height as 350 pixels, and then it marks the background color as blue because that's the next thing that comes up. But then once it hits the background color green line, what it'll do is overwrite the previous blue value and then change it to green. And just to solidify this example, I'm going to hop over to the examples demo that I have in the same folder as the README. So just a quick note about coding in this workshop. I'm going to be showing examples and hopping over to VS Code a lot. I highly recommend that you don't follow along just because I'm going to be going at a pretty fast pace. And if you do coding as well as listening to me, you might miss out on a couple things. But the good news is that I have marked some starter code that you can use just so you can do these examples on your own time too. So for the most part, just sit back and enjoy the show for now. So this is one of the index.html files that I have created for cascading and so on. Let's take a look first at this div tag that mirrors the one that I have in the slides. I'm going ahead and comment out the rest of this because I don't want to spoil what's coming up next. So how you comment in VS Code is you highlight everything. In Max, you do command /. I guess that didn't work. Is it command shift /? Yes. I think. Here, let me just comment out the ones I actually need to comment out. So this one and this one. Okay, cool. So we have this div, and in our style.css file that we've linked, we have these div rules that I have on the slides. Here I have 100 pixels, doesn't really matter. And then we have the blue, and then we have the green. So if I go ahead and open this file, spoilers, don't take a look at how disorganized everything is. But if I open this index.html file and move it over to here, sorry, let me just do this. We do in fact see that it takes on a color green. So if we inspect element by right-clicking, and I'm not sure if this was shown in previous workshops, but what you can do to check the styles of a specific element is by clicking this icon up here and then selecting the element. If I do that, we can see that on the right side, these do in fact show that green is taken priority of because background color of blue is first written down, but it gets crossed out by CSS and later the green's applied. So now you know that I'm not a liar, which is always good when someone's teaching you some new things. And without further ado, let's move on to the next quirk. So that's specificity. So specificity is another attribute that CSS has. And for this one, let's highlight another example that we can do. So again, we have a div, 350 pixels width and height, and it has a background color of green. And then in this case, we have a new ID that we call green sucks. And that ID will set the background color to purple. And then lastly, we have a class that's no purple sucks. And then it'll set a background color of blue. So in this case, if we have an index.html file that has all three of these applied to it, so it's a div, it's an ID, that it has ID green sucks, and it has the class of no purple sucks, what background color will its div have? Please help me, Twitch chat. Awesome, yeah, it is purple, but this is what CSS would have done if it didn't know what to do. Okay, so the answer is purple. And the reason for that is because CSS applies more specific rules over less specific rules. Now, what exactly do I mean by specificity? In CSS, there's this notion of some selectors being more specific than other selectors. So the least specific selectors that you can get are called type selectors. So this is what we've been working with as like these basic HTML elements, such as h1, p, div, and body. On top of that, some more specific selectors are class selectors. So that's like the user-defined classes that we've been creating. So any rule that's in a class selector that we have that conflicts with a type selector will be selected over the type selector rules. And finally, we have ID selectors, which are the most specific you can get. And all of these rules that are applied on this level will take precedence over any of the ones before. So that's class selectors and type selectors. Okay, last but not least, inheritance. So if you are coming from an object-oriented background, inheritance isn't as big, bad, and scary as it is over there. Here it just means that for any CSS rules you have in one element, they are going to be inherited from a parent element unless otherwise specified. So here we have an example. We have a p tag with an ID of inheritance p, and it's enclosing inside of it this piece of text, as well as another span element. So what exactly do I mean by parent and child in this case? In this relationship, the P would be considered the parent. And the reason for that is because it contains other HTML elements inside of it. And similarly, the HTML element inside of it is called a child because it has other HTML elements enclosing it. Oh, okay. So I'm going to move over to the demo. And inside the demo, I have this exact example lined up. Oh, sorry. I also forgot to show you the purple specificity example. So I'll also uncomment that so you know what's going on there. So let me go ahead and refresh my page over here. So here we have our infamous line from Avatar. And you can see that I've added a font weight to be bold on our span, just so I can show you that something is in fact happening to the span. But what's interesting is that we didn't say that the span itself should have a text color of gray, but in fact, it still takes on this text color because its parent element, which is the p tag, has its text color to be gray. So it inherited this property over from the parent element. And if we go over to the body and select that using our inspector, we'll see that it actually does tell us that this text color was inherited from this inheritance tag. But if we want to change the text element, and this is where that part of the definition where I said it's otherwise specified. So if I go back to my VS Code and hop over down here to where this font weight of bold and the span is being defined, if I go ahead and change the color for this to be, let's say red, so we can see it boldly how it changes. If I go spin over to here and refresh the page, it does in fact get its color set to red. And we can see over here on this panel that the gray color was crossed out because it sees that it was otherwise specified that it should have red instead of gray. Can we get the code and page side by side? Yes. Sorry, I was having some trouble because I already had this Google open, but let me fix that really quick. Okay, is this better? All right, cool beans. All right, so just as a recap of everything we've seen about these three things, rules on elements of the same specificity are applied in order. So that's cascading. More specific rules on elements take priority over less specific elements. So that's specificity. And finally, all child elements inherit their parent rules unless otherwise specified. Actually, this isn't all elements. It's most elements. There's actually like a defined list of elements that get inherited. There's some more information about that online, but I put all here just to simplify it. Cool. So with that, I'm going to fire a poll on cascading specificity and inheritance just to see how you guys are doing. And yeah, I'll give a couple minutes for this. So if we had another HTML element like A inside of span, would we do P span A? I think, yes, that works, but if you're going to do 2 levels of enclosing, it might be better just to put an ID on that A. Um, okay, so it looks like most of you have answered. I will quickly go through each question. Can you guys see the poll? Okay. Oh yeah, let me unpoll first. Okay, so for the first question, what would be the background color of the div? Cool, so most of you were on it. So it gets to blue. This is actually a case of where cascading and specificity both take place. So it might seem like we are going down this list and saying, oh, first it's blue, then it's red, then it's green. But actually, because we've specified this class, I love blue, and applied it to this div, and it has a background color of blue, that's the most specific attribute there. So in the end, this will be blue. Okay. For number 2, given this in index.html, yeah, so this is just another case of specificity. So red is chosen. Number 3, yeah, this is cascading and inheritance. So it just goes down. First, it marks the color as yellow, then marks as blue, then marks as pink. So pink is right. And finally, number 4, This one's actually a little bit confusing. So what actually happens is you might think it is the ID because that's the most specific. But interestingly enough, what actually takes over is the red, because it's the most like. So what happens is it inherits from confusion, so that's pink. But then it inherits from the div, so that takes over, and that's gray. And finally, the inner div will mark it as red, so that takes over. So this is like sort of demonstrating that cascading and specificity and inheritance sometimes behave in ways we don't expect it to happen, but it takes some practice in getting used to, but you know, practice makes perfect. Some of us are still debugging to this day, so. Cool, yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and, okay, so why does div take over number 4 but not 1? So for number 1, they're both being applied to the same element, so there isn't really any inheritance going on. If it's all being applied to the same element, then the only thing that really matters is both cascading and specificity. So in this case, there's no problem. It'll just take the class because it's more specific. Whereas in number 4, we are looking at the inheritance properties. So the inner one will be red, and that'll be the one that takes over. So, oh, sorry, guys. So the inner div is the most, like the innermost div. So that's the div without any IDs in this case. The what? Yeah, my bad for not defining that. Okay, were there any other questions I could answer? So number 4, the correct answer is red. I can actually hop over really quick and show this example. This will be really embarrassing if I like accidentally just mess this up while testing, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be red. So div id equals confusion. I am also confused. Then we have a div id equals I don't know. And then we just have a div, and inside of it, what? So let's go over to our style file and let's go define these IDs. We first have confusion, and that color will be pink. Then we have, I don't know, and the color will be pink. Wait, nope, gray. And lastly, we have our div, which should have a color of red. So hope this works. If we refresh, what the heck is that? Okay, let me comment out everything else.
I think it's because you have a hashtag.
You had a hashtag in front of your div.
Thank you. Yeah, what is red? So if I inspect the what, yeah, okay, so first we start out with pink because that was the outermost, so that's ID equals confusion. But then we could jump into the next inner level of divs, which is I don't know, and that color is gray. So then pink gets crossed out. But then lastly, we jump into the inner div, the innermost div, and then gray gets crossed out because div by itself with no identifiers is red. So inheritance takes priority over specificity in this case, which is why it ends up being red. Cool. Why doesn't inheritance apply to the innermost div? Do you mean, sorry, could you follow that up? I think for what I was trying to explain was like, the I don't know div inherits from the confusion div, and then the, okay, all good. All right, sounds great. So yeah, number 4 was supposed to be red. Unfortunately not UCLA blue, but that's in all of our hearts, so that's all good. All right, let's jump into the next topic then. Pseudo-classes. So pseudo-classes are used to define the style for a special state of an element. So what we've been working with so far has all been working with the normal state of an element, so what you immediately see on a web page. But what in CSS we can actually do is we can actually apply styles directly to a special state of an element. And these special states are different things. Some of you may have had experience in the past when you click a link, it actually changes color after you click it. So in this case, the link has turned purple, and that is considered the visited state in pseudo-classes. On the bottom, if you see a button and you hover over it and it changes color, so that's blue in this case, that is also another pseudo-class, which is the hover state. And in CSS, we can directly apply different styles to that, so we can change the color that's being shown. So here's the syntax for pseudo-classes. You can see that's pretty similar to the base syntax. The only difference is that you have to specify what pseudo-class we want to change the style of, as well as what selector we want the pseudo-class to refer to. And the way you do that is you add a selector, then you add a colon, and then the pseudo-class. So let's take a look at an example. Here is the first case when we had a link. If we wanted to change the color of it being clicked to purple, then we would do A, and then we would do colon visited because that's the pseudo-class of A. And then we would change the text color to purple. Similarly, for the bottom example, when we change the hover color to blue, how we would change that style is using the button and then referring to the hover pseudo-class, and then changing the background color to blue. So something else in pseudo-classes that is pretty unique is that there are certain keywords that are already been defined by CSS. And these are just easy ways to work with when you have multiple of the same kind of element within a parent element. So let's say you have a bunch of p tags and you want to say, oh, I want the first p tag to have a specific color. Well, in pseudo-classes, what you can do is you can do p colon first child and say what style you want that p tag to take. Similarly, for the last child, if you want the last p tag to take something, you would do p colon last child. And then finally, if you don't want the first or last, but you want something in between, or you just want more flexibility when it comes to styling, you would use nth child. And inside the parentheses would be n, and that's the number or position of that element within the parent element. So for the third p tag, you would say nth child parentheses 3, because it starts at 1. So yeah, without further ado, I will hop into the pseudo-classes part. Wrong way. Okay. So if I go to pseudo-classes, let's open up this index.html in this style. Well, this is getting kind of hard to navigate. Okay. So here I have a couple of things that I already defined. Hold up. Do you guys know how I can close the folder on the left side?
You should be able to close, like go to
Command
the.
V might work.
Command V?
Yeah.
Oh. Wait, that's just paste.
No, B.
Oh, B. Okay, cool, thanks. Sorry, yeah. Okay, so I have a couple things going on here. Let me just delete this first. Let me open that index.html file. Okay, so let's take a look first at the pseudo-classes part. Ignore the keywords for now. I have a link here, and it's purple because I think the browser just remembered that I clicked this before. But let's say we wanted to change this hover color to something else. Let's say we wanted to change it to pink. So what we would do in that case is go into our style.css file, and we would change the pseudo-class. So this is the hover pseudo-class. So we would have the a tag, colon, hover, and let's have the color be pink. So once we've added this, if we refresh, we should see, yeah, so every time we hover over this, we now see that it's pink. And the reason why we actually don't see anything before this change is because originally the pseudo class doesn't have anything inside of it, so nothing really happens. Cool. And if you're wondering what crouton is, it's literally just a page with a crouton on it. So, okay, so let's get into keywords. So this is the bottom example. If I hop back into the index.html file, excuse me.
It smells really good.
Does it? So we have this div tag, and we have 4 paragraph tags inside of it. And they all have the class of my lyrics. And you can see it's a, you know, a perfect rendition of Lose Yourself by Eminem, at least how I remember the lyrics. So let's go ahead and customize this a little bit with the pseudo class keywords. Cool, let's change the first paragraph to pink again, because I'm not that creative of a person. So let's apply it to .mylyrics, and let's use a pseudo class. So colon first child, and we will set the color to pink. So within mylyrics, which is the p tag, it'll say I want the first child to be pink. So if we refresh, it does in fact get changed to pink. So we can do the same thing if we want to change the last tag to something else. Let's say for this case, we want it to be, sorry, last child. We want this one to be blue. So if I save, refresh again, it takes on the blue because it's the last p tag inside the div. And then finally, if it's not first and last, we're going to have to use nth child. So if we want to change the third p tag to something else, let's do nth child. So it'll be 1, 2, 3. And let's change this one to red. So we'll change the color to red. Cool. Yeah, so that's how pseudo class keywords work. I mean, this already looks better than your, you know, your everyday CS course website. I would say so myself. Okay, so there was a question about if we needed to know these pseudo class names by heart. Well, these were set by CSS like guidelines, but you don't have any like obligation to memorize these. These are always one click away. I have a link right here in the slides, and I see that Jody has also provided that link. So yeah, you can always refer to that just to get these right off the bat. All right.
Another question.
Yep.
When would you use these pseudo classes instead of just styling each one with an ID?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes, so in that case, we could have also just, you know, let's go back to our index.html. So you're right. Like in this case, we could have been like, oh, ID equals P1, and I want that to take on something. I also want ID equals P2. But you can already start to see why we wouldn't want to do this, because that's a lot of IDs being applied to different elements. And it could be really confusing just to see all these IDs and having to, you know, name them different things because IDs have to be unique. So one benefit of pseudo classes would be if you find yourself having a lot of the similar tags used in the same parent element. So in this case, this would be a lot of different Ps within a div. It would be a lot easier to refer to those using pseudo classes as opposed to just like blowing everything up with IDs everywhere. But again, that's a matter of opinion. Also check with your team to see what they prefer and what their best practices are. Cool. Any other questions? If not, let us transition to transitions. So transitions are the first movable thing we're working with. Up to this point, everything has been static, which is, you know, kind of boring. So what transitions are is they allow properties to smoothly change from one state to another over a duration of time. And you can see in this GIF, it starts small, then it transitions smoothly to something a little bit bigger and does all that stuff. So yeah, in transition, there's a notion of a beginning state and an end state. The beginning state in this GIF would be, the smaller size, and the end state would be something bigger. I knew someone would comment on this. It is GIF, not GIF. So, I'm hoping some neurons are also firing in your head right now when I mentioned state, because we just looked at how we can work with state, right? With pseudo-classes. So yeah, transitions can actually be triggered by pseudo-classes. In this case, I've used hover as my example. You start with a beginning width of 100 pixels, let's say, and then once you hover, you will have a width of 300 pixels. And you can kind of predict that without transitions, this would be a really abrupt change. It would like suddenly jolt to something wider, which is not something we would add in our web page. So to make this a little smoother, we would add a transition on top of our beginning state. And once we hover, it will slowly move over a duration time to this wider state in the end. And yeah, I couldn't really show how transitions are on like static slides. So I just have Aang here airbending an air emoji to make it a little bigger. Hope you guys are okay with that one. So here's the syntax for transitions. We define two separate states, like we mentioned. The first one is the normal state. So that's the beginning. It'll be 100 pixels wide and tall. It'll also have a background color of red. And then the end state would be what would be after the trigger. So the trigger is the actual action of hovering, and the end state would be the hovered state. So once it's hovered, we want it to take on 300 pixels to be its width. So by itself, this would, again, be really abrupt. So what we would do to make this transition smoother would be by adding this transition line. So transition allows you to specify the property you want to transition on, as well as the duration, so how long the transition will take. And by adding this, no longer is it abrupt. You'll see a very smooth, silky transition over. So before I hop into the demo, there are a couple other properties associated with transitions. The two that you've seen so far are the property and duration. You can use the transition property to, refer to these shorthand, but by themselves, they can also be defined separately as transition property and transition duration. On top of this, you also have transition timing function. So that's the speed curve of the transition. And what that kind of means is like, oh, how fast will it start out? And then how fast will it end up? And then finally, a transition delay. So that's how long it'll wait before starting the transition. Sorry. But yeah, so these are a couple of the properties. If you want to refer back anytime, here's a full list. But yeah, let's hop into a quick demo. So let me open up, this would be transitions animations. Let's open up that index.html and that style.html. Okay. So we have specified a div with an ID of transition here. And if we hop over to our style.css file, I've given it the base state of having width of 100 pixels, having a height of 100 pixels, and background color of red, just like we saw in the slides. So if I open up that index.html file again, pause for suspense. Yeah, so nothing's really happening to this transition. When it's hovering, nothing happens. But if we add a trigger to make it go into something else, so an end state, for example, let's say transition hover, the width should be 300 pixels. Something will now happen once we hover over this div, or it should have. Let's see, did I miss something? Oh, sorry, just in refresh. Okay, yeah, so once it's hovered, it now gets wider. But this is the abrupt thing I mentioned. No one wants to see this transition. Or it's not even a transition, it's just a bloop. Okay, let's make it a transition. Whoops, sorry, going back to style.css. So like we saw, the way we make this smoother is by adding that transition line. So transition, and we want to make it a transition on the width property. So we add width here. And let's say we want it to last 2 seconds. So we add 2s. So once we save and refresh again, it transitions very smoothly. This is a lot easier on the eyes. Very nice. This is a very basic example, but you can get really crazy with transitions. Let's take a look at the other properties we saw before. So the transition timing function is the speed curve. So that's like, there's a couple values. These are all in the list that I linked in the slides. But one I will use as an example is ease in. So this means you'll like start out slow, but it'll ease its way up to becoming faster. So hopefully this comes through. If I refresh again, you can kind of tell, I hope, that it's starting out slower. If I make this 1 second, maybe that'll be better. Yeah, okay, a little bit. So another property that we saw is the transition delay. Let's make it wait half a second. Yeah, so now once you hover, it waits half a second before it does anything. If I take my mouse off, it does the same thing the backwards way. So that's just a little bit going into transitions. You can actually write all these 3 lines into one because the transition is meant to be a shorthand way of applying all these properties at once. So I can actually delete all of this and add ease in as the 3rd value to transition. And I can also delete all of this and add 0.5 seconds as the 4th value. And once I save and I refresh, if I hover over, it does the exact same thing. And this is a lot cleaner in terms of code. Okay, any questions? See, they're being answered. Okay. So I think it's okay. If not, I will transition to animations. That one didn't work as well, but now we're talking about animations. Okay, so animations lets an element change from one style to another. And if this definition sounds a little bit similar, it's because transitions are actually one type of animations. It's just that they're a little bit more limited in what they can do because you start with a beginning state and an end state that has to be triggered. But on the other hand, animations encompasses a much broader range of movement and is a lot more flexible, a lot more expressive, and it gives you a lot more fine-grained control. So here I have a GIF of the difference between transitions and animations. Let me cycle through one more time. So transitions is the beginning and end state, just gets bigger. But animations, you know, oh, she's going kind of crazy. You know, animations get a little wild sometimes. But yeah, so that's just a little bit of insight into how animations are different and a little bit more expressive. But the caveat for them being more expressive is that the syntax is a little bit more complex. So instead of directly applying a transition into the beginning state, we have to define a separate keyframe. So this is another body in your CSS file. So the way we specify keyframe is by using the @keyframes keyword and then naming the keyframe whatever we want. So in this example, we have 2. On the top, you have example 1 keyframe. On the bottom, you have example 2 keyframe. And within these keyframes, you just define what you want to happen during the animation. So let's take a look at example 1 first. This one might be a little more similar to what we've been working with transitions because there's a from state that is a background color of red. So that's like your beginning state. And the 2 is your end state. So that'll change to background color of yellow by the end of the animation. And conversely, the bottom shows a little bit more of the expressive nature of animations. You don't only have to define a beginning and end state, but you can also define some intermediary steps using percentages. So in this case, we're saying at the start, so 0%, we want the background color to be red. And then 25% of the way through the animation, we want it to turn to yellow, and then green 50% of the way. And then finally, at the end, it should end with blue. And then animations takes care of making these changes really smoothly. Cool. So once we have defined our keyframe, the way we apply it is by adding these lines into whatever element we want to apply the animation to. So in this div, I've chosen example 1 to be animated or to be set to this animation. And the way we import that over is using animation name, and then we set that to the name of the keyframe that we gave it. And then again, just like transitions, it has to last over a duration of time. So we have to set the animation duration property to whatever we want to be how long it is. So 4 seconds in this case. So similarly to transitions, there's just a bunch of other properties that we can specify to fine tune our animations. A couple of these you can see direct parallels to transitions. Name is kind of like transition property. It's just the name of the animation keyframe. Duration is the time. We had that too. Delay we also had. Timing function we also had. Some 2 new properties that I might put more attention to are animation iteration count. So since animations are sort of fired immediately, you can also specify how many times you want the animation to run. So in example 1, that's like how many times you want it to go from red to yellow, and then for it to run back and do that again. So it just takes a number. So you can do 1, 2, 3. But you can also make it run indefinitely using a special value that's just infinite. So you can just say animation iteration count is infinite, and it'll just keep going for all of its life. And then lastly, animation direction is the direction to run the animation. If you want it to run normally, that's just the default value, but you can also go backwards using reverse. So that'll run the animation backwards. Okay, so let me hop back into the demo. So let me go down to the animation section. Here we've defined another div, which has an ID of animation. So this is the one I'll be working with in this example. So let's say we want to create an animation that indefinitely cycles through red, green, blue, and yellow. So as we just saw, what we would have to do first is have a place to store our animation information. So that would be in the keyframe. So that would be at keyframes. Let's call this my keyframe, because I'm so creative. And then let's define what each stage should look like in this animation. So 0%, I want the background color to have a red background color. So we would have these braces and set the background color to be red. And this is just like putting a CSS rule in line. Okay, now 25% of the way, I want the background color to change to green. So let's set the background color to green. And then 50% of the way, we want background color to be, I said blue, so blue. And then lastly, 100% of the way, we want it to end on yellow. So if we refresh the page, you'll notice that nothing really changes, because what we have to do before starting the animation is putting the keyframe onto the thing that we want to animate. So if the thing we want to animate is this animation div, what we would have to do is apply it using animation name and the name of the keyframe. And then also putting a time for this animation. So animation duration should be 4 seconds. So now, if all is working correctly, we can see that it does in fact animate through these different backgrounds. And there is some sort of smooth transition between these colors, like it's not just flipping through them. So that's all taken care of by animations. Cool, yeah, so as it currently is, it just runs through it one time and it just stops. It goes back to its normal state. But if we wanted to make it run infinitely, we could set the animation iteration count to something else. So if we want it to be, going on forever, then that would be infinite. So once we save that and refresh again, it'll just continue cycling through these colors for, its entire life. I don't know about you, but this saves a lot of money as opposed to going to raves. If you just stare at these all day. I mean, that's what I do. I don't know about you guys. So yeah, that was a lot of information. Before we go on a break, I'm going to fire one more poll just to see how you guys are doing. Okay, that should be live. Let me put on the lo-fi again. Oh, really quick, there is a typo on number 5. Everywhere it says animation, it should be animation name. I should not have worked on this while sleep deprived, so that's on me. Okay, I think that's about enough time. I'll go ahead and end the poll for everyone. Cool, okay. So what would we add in the blank to make every link turn yellow once it's been clicked? That was kind of a trick question. The style that you want to be, sorry, the pseudo class that you want to be applying to is the visited. I don't think clicked is actually a pseudo class unless I'm mistaken. Number 2, what should we add in the blank to make every even number div in a parent element have a purple background? Oh yeah, you guys are gonna have to forgive me for this one. I wanted to teach this one, but I didn't know where to shoehorn it in. So I put it as an instructional question. For those of you who said I sucked, you hurt my feelings. So number 3, if we want to expand this div's height to 500 pixels within 3 seconds, what should be in the blanks? Awesome, yeah. Most of you got it right. So we would add transition to define the transition, and you would have the property and the duration. And then we want it to trigger this transition when it's hovered. So we would add div hover, and then have a height of 500 pixels as its end state. Number 4, what transition timing function and animation timing function would make the animation start slowly and gradually speed up? Yep, that is in fact ease in. Ease out is the exact opposite. So it'll start really fast, and then right when it's about to end, it'll start slowing down. Ease in out is a combination of both. So it'll start slow, in the middle it'll be fast, and then it'll end slow. And then linear is actually the default, that what we saw, just so linearly gets bigger. And number 5, if we have a keyframe example that we want to work 5 times in reverse, what should be in the blanks? Yeah, so the correct answer is the majority. So animation name, that's on me, should be set to the example keyframe. And then the animation direction should be set to a reverse. And then the animation iteration count should be 5 because we want this animation to run 5 times. Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. And with that, let us take our break. So I'm going to give everyone 10 minutes, I think. So from the now, it'll be 7:17. And after the break, we will be taking a look at layouts. So feel free to stick around for that too.
Manage your development team with Monday.com. Build product roadmaps, track bugs, plan sprints, and get instant reports on where everything stands.
Only I could have helped you.
Always wanted to become a great singer? Hey, I'm Jada Facer, and I'm a popular singer here on YouTube.
When I feel lost, I fall right back on you.
And I get asked all the time for advice on how to become a better singer. So many people dream of having a beautiful singing.
All right. That is the last thing we're going to hear for the break. Let us reconvene. All right, let's hop into the second part of the workshop. This one is going to deal with layout. And here's another meme as a checkpoint for all of you. Okay, now, swoogity swoogity, layout will now be our property after this part. So we're going to be taking a look at two different layout tools that are commonly used in web dev. One is Flexbox and one is Grid. So we'll be taking a very surface look at both of them. There's definitely not enough time within a 2-hour workshop to cover like all the intricacies, but I'm hoping that you'll come out of this with a little bit more of an understanding of what each one's used for. So let's take a look at how life was before Flexbox and Grid. Before we had any of these tools, we had to use tables in HTML. I won't be covering much about them, but all you have to know about them is that they're not that adaptive. There was a lot of hacking and like roundabout ways you had to do to position different things. And it was all in all just really difficult. And yes, pain. It was very painful. And simple concepts that people had to commonly do were very difficult. For example, you probably very often need to vertically center an element. Not an easy way to do this with table-based layouts. Also, you might want to make children elements take an equal amount of width and height within a parent container. Also very difficult. So what they did in response to this was created some wonderful tools, Flexbox and Grid. These are two separate tools, and you can think of them as two different solutions to the same issue. and they're just layout tools for adaptive layout. And both of them deal one way or another with how child elements are laid out within their parent elements. So they look at layout in two different ways. Flexbox is one-dimensional, so you're either working with rows and columns at a time, whereas as grid suggests, it's two-dimensional, so you're working with both rows and columns at the same time. So first, let's take a look at Flexbox and how that works. Flexbox is, as I've just mentioned, layout in one dimension. So you can either flex the row-wise or you can flex column-wise. And in Flexbox, child elements can be laid out in any direction or orientation. They can each flex, quote unquote, their sizes according to the space that they have remaining in the container. And finally, they can be easily vertically and horizontally aligned. So this directly addresses that centering thing that was before. And to help us understand a little bit more about how Flexbox works, I will introduce a new character for all of you. So this is Flexbox Chan. So let's go a little bit of terminology with Flexbox Chan. So the container is what you can see in darker purple. That is what we've been referring to before as the parent element. And in this case, we call it a flex container. And within this flex container, we're going to be working with how flex items are aligned. So these are the child elements. So in order to use Flexbox, what you would do inside your CSS is whatever container you want to enable Flexbox on, you would have to add display flex to that element. So once we add display flex, all of our items will go from columns to becoming rows. So here's some properties that you might commonly find in Flexbox. First up is direction. So this is dealing with how items will be like laid out. So immediately out of the box, it'll be row. So Flexbox enables a row-wise layout. So that'll be left to right in whatever order that you specified in your CSS file. Row reverse will be doing the exact opposite. So that's right to left. And column will be top to bottom, while column reverse is also bottom to top. So before I hop into the other properties, I'm going to take a quick detour into how axes work in Flexbox. This is how we refer to how different things are aligned. So first up, the main axis goes along the direction of the flex direction. So if your flex direction is a row or row reverse, you'll be dealing with what's on the right side. So the main axis is going horizontal, which is the direction of the row. And for columns, the main axis will be going along the direction of the column because you're dealing with columns. Whereas the cross axis is going to be perpendicular to what your flex direction is. So for rows, it's going to be vertically, whereas in column directions, it's going to be horizontally. So with that in mind, let's hop into the next couple of alignment properties. So first up is justify content. And justify content deals with how items are aligned along the main axis. So horizontal for rows, vertical for columns. And here are a couple of properties that I was too lazy to put out of the screenshot. So flex start packs everything to the front of the container. Center is doing the centering that we mentioned before. And here are a couple others that do spacing related things. So space between will put equal space between all of the items as the name suggests. So it'll put the leftmost item all the way to the line of the container, and then it'll put the other one on the way to the other edge of the container. Whereas space around will equally distribute space around the items. So things are evenly spaced and there's still space around the edges. Okay, and on the flip side, we also have the align items property. So this align items is dealing with alignment along the cross axis. So that's the perpendicular axis. And you have some similar properties for align items. You have flex start, which will align them all by their top. So it'll push everything to the top, assuming this is a row flex direction. And flex end pushes everything to the bottom. Center is going to center it. And stretch will flex all of the items all the way to the remaining space of the parent container. Okay, so I'm going to give a really quick demo of Flexbox. I'm only going to be touching surface stuff. So let's hop into our Flexbox grid index.html and style.css. So if I close the previous example and I'll hop over to Flexbox and grid. Okay, so what we have off the bat is kind of ugly. That is also on me because I chose pink and purple, but everything is vertically aligned. And what we want to do ideally is put these all row-wise. And if we hop into our style.css file, well, first off, I should cover that we have this flex container, which is the background color of dark purple. And then we have the div. So these are the child flex items, which I've named flex item, just so it's easier to see what each is related to. And those are the pink background colors. So I've defined 5 different flex items here. And if we hop over to the Flexbox example, you can see the background colors I just mentioned. Each flex item will take a width of 100 pixels and heights and a margin, so that's spacing between 10 pixels. You can see that I'm using the nth child even here, which is why I wanted to cover it a little bit earlier. I just wanted to vary up the sizes a little bit differently, so I made every even flex item have 200 pixels instead of 100, so we can see how align items works. So first and foremost, to make this Flexbox, let's go ahead and add the display flex property. And right off the bat, we should get out of the box, yeah, a nice flex over so that everything is row-wise. So now all our items are in a row, and it goes from left to right. Yeah, and you can also see that Flexbox does some additional spacing for us. Like we mentioned before that margin should give us 10 pixels all corners around. But if we remove this line and go back to what it used to be, let me wait for refresh. Okay, yeah, it actually doesn't give us that spacing in the top and bottom. So Flexbox is adaptively adding this on for us, which is really nice when you're working with layouts. So let's take a look now at flex direction. So if I add flex direction to be column, it's actually a little bit different to what it was before. It actually does add those top and bottom spacings that we were missing before. And if I delete that and go back to the row-wise, let's play around with justify content. So because we're working with the rows right now, justify content will be going horizontally. If I want to push every one of these items all the way to the end, we would do justify content flex end. And if I go ahead and refresh, all of the items are indeed in the end of the container. And if I wanted to space everything evenly such that the leftmost item is all the way to the edge and the right all the way to the right edge, I would change this to be justify content space between. And now they all take even space and the left and right items are all the way pushed to the edge. Okay, and last but not least, let's do align items. So this is dealing with, since we're working with row directions, this is the cross axis, so that's the vertical line. If we want to center all of these horizontally, then we would put center for the value of aligned items. And once we refresh, these do in fact get put to the center. Great, yeah, so I hope this gave you guys an idea of why Flexbox is so popular and why it's used everywhere. These row layouts used to be really difficult with tables, so now we can literally just do it within 3 lines. So that's always a plus. Okay, so that was just a very rough intro, very surface level intro to Flexbox. Are there any questions before I enter grid? How to put, yeah, go for it.
I was just going to read out the question.
Okay, how would you put content in the flex item? Similarly to how you put content in any item in HTML. Just like, this is separate from Flexbox. Flexbox is directly dealing with how these elements are laid out. It doesn't really regard the content inside of these items, but they can have anything. You know, I could just add a quick ooh right here. And then that would just be the content inside of your div. That's kind of small. Ooh. And back. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, unless you're referring to something else. Okay, if not, then I will go ahead and jump into grid. So, oh, I didn't see the HTML before until now. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I went a little bit fast, but yeah, so you would just work with it just as you would for any HTML container or content, I mean. Okay, so grid. Grid, as I mentioned before, is two-dimensional instead of one-dimensional. So you're dealing with rows and columns at the same time. So each of the child elements are now referred to as grid items. And these grid items can take a specified row and a column, and that's where they will be placed at. They can also take like a span of multiple rows and columns. So that's why some of these items are bigger than others. I won't get into that today, but that is just a whole other world out there for you to explore. So yeah, a couple more terminologies. Grid container, that's the parent element now, and you're now specifying what is being laid out inside of that grid container. Okay, so this is the syntax for grid. Similarly to Flexbox, to enable grid, you would add this display grid to your CSS container. The reason why there isn't any graphic to the right of this is because this line by itself doesn't really do much. What you have to do after adding this line is define a grid template. So you're sort of outlining how many rows and columns your grid is going to take, your grid container. So the way we do this in grid is defining two properties. One property is the grid template columns property, and the other is the grid template rows. And for each of them, they take like space separated values, and each value is going to specify how much length or height that column is going to take. So let's say we want to take, in this example, it's 5 columns, and we would just list out each of the sizes of those columns. So we want the first column to be 40 pixels, the second column to be 50 pixels. And auto is just a special keyword in grid to say, I want to just automatically assign this column the remainder of the space that's left in the container. And then 50 pixels and 40 pixels again. So that defines 5 columns, each with its own length. And then similarly for grid template rows, we would define 3 rows in this case. So 25%, in this case is saying that I want to take 25% of the grid container. 100 pixels is fixed, and again, auto. So once this process is done, you should see internally, this won't be reflected, but you will see something like this happen behind the scenes. So on the top, you can see all the column lengths that we've specified, and the rows, and it makes a really nice grid that we can work with. And each of these specified one individual row and column, each make up a grid cell that you can put your grid item inside. Cool. Okay, so some of these alignment properties are pretty similar in terms of syntax to Flexbox. There is a distinction though. There's justify items, align items, and justify content and align content. And they'll deal with different things. So first I'll cover justify items and align items. They're going to be aligning grid items, the grid items inside the grid. So justify items does it along the row axis. So this is going horizontally. And align items does it vertically. So this is along the column axis. So here I have an example of you applying justify items start to the column, the row wise, and align items start. So on the left, you can see the result of doing justify items start. Everything is pushed to the left of its grid cell, and align items start will push everything to the top of its grid cell. So here are just a couple of the other properties that you can assign to justify items and align items. Something to note is that it's not grid start and grid end, just like you would expect it to be after seeing Flexbox. It's just straight up start and end. Also, center and stretch are pretty similar to what they were in Flexbox. They'll just put the grid item at the center and also stretch it in its entire grid cell. Okay, so now let's take a look at the other thing I mentioned, justifying and aligning content. So these two properties are aligning the grid itself, so the entire grid along the row axis and column axis within its container. So nothing happens to the grid items themselves. This does not deal with that. Instead, what it'll do is move the grid. So here I have an example of justify content center. So that's aligning on the row axis, putting it right in the middle. And since I couldn't fit both diagrams, here's the parallel for align content center. It's moving everything to the center column axis wise. So right in the middle vertically. And similarly, it has similar values for justify content and align content. You have start and center stretch again. So those will do what you expect them to do in terms of how the grid is sized. Some two new ones are very similar to what Flexbox was doing, space around and space between. So space around will separate depending on if you are putting it on justified content and line content. If you put it on justified content, it'll separate and space out the columns equally and put it, equally distribute the spacing. Whereas if you put it on a line content, it'll separate the rows. And similarly for space between, it'll space it out such that the left and right most columns are put right on the edges. So with that, let's go back into our little sandbox and go down to my grid container example. Spend a little bit more time on this, this page this time. So I've defined a grid container as my outermost div class. This will, of course, be the parent element and the grid container. I've also assigned, I forgot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 2. So 12 grid items. Each of them will be taking a specified amount of height, which I'll go into after I jump into the style.css file, which I'll do right now, actually. So if I scroll down to where grid stuff is being defined. My grid container, I've assigned to have a background color of blue. And you can already kind of see it in the browser view. And for the grid items, I put each width and height to be 100 pixels and 100 pixels and have a background color of aqua. And this time I wanted to spice it up a little, so I made every nth child that is odd have a height of 50 pixels. Okay, so on its own, nothing really, it doesn't really look like anything. This actually just looks like an entire column. But let's go ahead and enable a grid on here. And if I refresh, it doesn't really change because we haven't defined a grid template yet. So let's go ahead and do that. So since it's 12, let's do a layout that makes it divisible and have 12 grid items, grid cells, sorry, total. Let's have it have 4 columns, so grid template columns. Let me just do 200 pixels, 400 pixels, 300 pixels, 300 pixels, 200 pixels. And again, I put grid. Again, let's do it for rows, so grid template rows. Let's make this be 100 pixels, 200 pixels, 100 pixels. Okay, so if I go ahead and refresh again, now it is put out in a grid, albeit a little bit ugly. So everything's put into its individual cell. It's a little bit hard to tell, but there are in fact 4 columns, so that goes this way, and there are 3 rows. And I think the reason why we can't see it exactly here is because I haven't aligned it yet. So I'll go ahead and do that really quick. Let us justify the content first so that this grid is centered, not the items, the grid. I think it's a little bit hard to see because I'm split screening, but this does center the items inside the container. Let's also justify the items to be, let's do end. So now everything gets pushed to the end row axis wise because we're dealing with justify items. And then lastly, let us align the items and let's put them at the center. So now we can finally see the different divs that it's actually taking shape of because we're putting each item at the center of its grid cell. It was difficult to see before, but now we can in fact see that there are 12 divs. Great, yeah. So I think that's all I wanted to cover for both Flexbox and Grid in terms of demos. I only touched the surface, but let's take a quick sneak peek at what's been happening with Grid in the developer world. So this is a screenshot of one of the pages on Daily Ruin. And it might not look like it, but this website was actually designed using Grid. It might be a little clearer if I add some columns to this. So we can actually divide the space up into different columns. So this is what Grid's doing behind the scenes. We can see that this carousel on the top left is taking up 9 columns. This little newsfeed on the top right is 3 columns. And then on the bottom, these 4 different panels are all evenly 3 columns. So this is something that I didn't show today, but yes, these grid cells can, or these grid items can in fact take multiple columns and multiple rows. And you can really use this to your advantage to make really dynamic, really adaptive, really cool looking websites in the future. Okay, so after showing you both of these options, you might have the question of which one you should use or which one you should learn. The biggest distinction up front is that Flexbox is one-dimensional and Grid is two-dimensional. At the same time, this is a matter of opinion, but this does make Grid more powerful, but at the same time a little more complex to learn. And in your developer life, you may choose to actually use both at the same time on projects, just to have a more versatile toolkit. So in answer to that question, all I can really say is yes. If you have time to learn both, it's good. If you have time to learn one of them, that's also good. I think in the end, having layout tools, period, is good. And it's a lot easier to work with your items. So there's a question, can you change the amount of columns or rows that a grid element takes up using a transition? That is a good question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe one of the mentors does. I will leave that to an exercise to the reader. Okay, so last but not least, I'm going to leave you guys with a couple of resources that you can use to really hone your skills for Flexbox and Grid. Oh yeah, no problem. So these are the guides that I've used to compile these. They go way into more detail about what properties are available in Flexbox and Grid. It's not only just aligning content, there's also flex wrapping, there's also grid gap, so how much space each takes, and also what I mentioned, like taking multiple grid cells. So all of these are covered in both of these guides. I've also put some more interactive practice that you can use to really hone your skills in Flexbox and Grid. One very popular one in every year of Hackschool has always been the Flexbox Froggy. Usually it's been put in the middle, but I put it at the end, so you guys are forced to listen to me. And there's also Grid Garden, which is a way to practice grid. So both of these are pretty fun game kind of ways to learn. But yeah, with that being said, thank you guys so much for sticking around, and thank you for listening to my advanced CSS workshop. Again, as a reminder, please fill out our feedback form and give us some more feedback about how we're doing and to have a chance to win an Amazon gift card. Next session coming up next week is asynchronous JS. This was kind of the weird middle child of our workshops where it wasn't JavaScript, but it was pretty fun personally. So yeah, thank you guys so much for sticking around. We will still be here. So if you just want to, chill until the official end time, play some Flexbox Froggy or Grid Garden, then that is all good. But otherwise, that is all I have. So thanks.
Voice and the secret.
Is it just me, or does the feedback form go to something about JavaScript?
That is my mistake. Give me one moment. Everyone hold your feedback. Actually, whoever answered that in the meantime, the first feedback form link in the beginning of the slides should lead to the same thing, or the correct thing. So you can use that for now. I'm currently working on making the second one correct too.
Okay, it should be fixed now.
Thanks, Jody.
Sometimes life is like this dark tunnel. You can't always see the light at the end of the tunnel. But if you just keep moving,